Metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body. And what this means is there's constant chemical reactions responsible for building up and breaking down nutrients constantly so that our body stays in homeostasis. So the two main types of metabolism are anabolism, and the word anabolism refers to the idea of constructing larger molecules. So it's always the synthesis of large molecules that start out from small ones. So a few of those examples are glucose being added, many glucose molecules being added to make the larger polysaccharide called glycogen. There's also the example of glucose that can be used to make fats or part of the molecule, and that's called triglycerides. Or the glucose can be converted into proteins. So glucose is the main monomer, the smallest unit of sugar that our body needs to form anything that's needed for constructive processes. So, for example, to make enzymes that are needed to make proteins that fit in the plasma membrane to form gates or pumps. So there's many examples of that happening. And then when there's excess glucose that's in the bloodstream, it's going to have to be stored, and it's converted to glycogen, which is stored in the liver, skeletal muscles, or sometimes the liver as well. So the other example of anabolism would be fatty acids being added together to make triglycerides, or amino acids added together to make proteins. So in all of these examples, the monomer, the single unit molecule, would be glucose. That's the monomer for carbohydrates. The fatty acids would be the monomers for triglycerides, the smallest unit. And amino acids would be the smallest unit that is added together to make proteins. So again, anabolism means that all of these small units, monomers, are added to produce a polymer, a larger molecule. The opposite of anabolism is called catabolism, and this happens with hydrolysis. So there's water that's added to break a bond. It breaks apart larger complex structures into smaller individual units. So it's essentially the opposite of what we've seen up here for anabolism. It's changing large molecules into smaller molecules. So one example of that is glycolysis, starting with a glucose molecule, sugar, and it's being broken into smaller molecules called pyruvic acid, which we'll see in a little bit. Glycogen being split into glucose molecules, triglycerides breaking down into glucose molecules, proteins into glucose molecules, triglycerides, which are the polymer, broken down into the individual units, which would be the fatty acids, and the proteins being broken down into amino acids. So the three stages of metabolism are shown on this diagram. So the first is going to be what occurs in the GI tract, the gastrointestinal system. So those nutrients have to be broken down into absorbable units. Obviously, the steak and the eggs are not ready to be absorbed until they're broken down into the monomers, which are the amino acids. The bread, the pasta, can't directly be absorbed. It has to be broken down into the monomers, which is the glucose and other sugars. And also the fats are not ready to be absorbed as well until they're broken down into individual units, the glycerol and the fatty acids. So once these monomers are absorbed into the bloodstream, now the tissue cells can use them for metabolism. And one of the examples of metabolism would be the catabolism. The glucose is broken down into a smaller molecule called pyruvic acid. And the third step is the mitochondria. The mitochondria, you've learned, is the main site for ATP synthesis. So in the mitochondria, there's two metabolic pathways that happens. There's the citric acid cycle, and then there's one called oxidative phosphorylation. But the end result is a whole lot of ATP, which is now utilized to synthesize or carry out many processes throughout the body. So we're first going to talk about carbohydrate metabolism. So when the glucose enters into the cell, it's first going to be phosphorylated into glucose 6-phosphate. And all this means is a phosphorus is added. So now it can complete glycolysis. So you should know what glycolysis is, what goes into it, and what's produced. And so, again, these glucose molecules, they're going to be stored in the skeletal muscle and the liver. But when they need to be used to make ATP, the glycolysis is the first step. And so this slide is showing us the 3 steps in how glucose is catabolized. And the first step is glycolysis. The second is the Krebs cycle. And the third is the electron transport chain and the oxidative phosphorylation. So the glycolysis occurs just in the cytoplasm, but steps 2 and 3, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, they occur in the mitochondria. So it starts out with glucose, and the end result is 32 ATP that is produced from the mitochondria. So during cellular respiration, which is what we just looked at, the ATP is formed, and you should know these 3 different pathways and where they occur at. You don't have to know all the individual steps of them, just the big picture, what enters, what comes out. And so again, the glycolysis is in the cytosol. So the other 2, the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation, they're in the mitochondria. And that's what forms the bulk of all of the ATP. So we're going to first look at the Krebs cycle. And again, you don't have to know all the individual steps. Just know, first of all, that it occurs in the mitochondria, as we can see up here at the top. And what happens is the glycolysis, you should know, is glucose into pyruvic acid. So that pyruvic acid, there's a transition where it's converted to a chemical called acetyl-CoA, and it enters the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. Both are the same. And the end result is there's some carbon dioxide as waste that's produced. And there's also a couple ATP that are produced, but not as much as the electron transport chain. So we're going to look at the total amount of ATP, which is really the important take-home point to know. So knowing here that glycolysis is glucose to pyruvic acid, and the net result is 2 ATP from that. Again, not the large majority that we need. Then in the mitochondria, there are 2 things that happen. There's the citric acid cycle, which makes 2 ATP. So again, not that many. But the electron transport chain produces 28 ATP. So the net result is about 30 ATP, 30 to 32 ATP. So this, again, this most significant amount is the electron transport chain.